on behalf of the Department of English and all the other faculty members and all others are present here today. I also take this opportunity to welcome the faculty members from other institutions and our dear students from ESH, from both the main campus as well as from the East campus, and also the students from other colleges and universities. I also take this opportunity to appreciate my colleagues who have visualized this program, and especially Dr. Aravind Nair, who is the class teacher of the first MA students. So I wish a very pleasant evening and a very fruitful academic evening. And I now request Professor Indula to begin his lecture. Welcome, sir.
Dear Dr. Johnson, who is a personal friend and a very valued academic, other members on the faculty of SH College Tevara, and my dear students. As Johnson has already indicated, SH College Tevara is almost like a kind of home to me, because that's one place where I have very close friends and associates, and I visit every year, and therefore I feel like returning every once in a while to my own home. And I'm very happy to address a new batch of students who have joined this prestigious institution to study English language and literature at the postgraduate level. I was asked to speak about why English literary studies. The fact that we feel compelled to defend ourselves about the choice of English or literature as a choice for our academic pursuit tells quite a lot about how we have become very science-oriented or technology-oriented in the modern world. Maybe 2 or 3 centuries ago, choosing literature or literary studies was automatic. Nobody would question the validity of that choice. Nobody would feel compelled to defend that choice. There was no reason why we had to defend our decision. But now we do, probably to ourselves and also to others.
Good evening, sir.
Mainly because we are living in a world where technology, science has an upper hand, and we are in a world where probably technology rules the roost. But then what is the significance of literature in this world? Terry Eagleton defined literature as fine writing. Fine writing itself, of course, is something that can be redefined from time to time, because what is fine is not always the same. Fine itself is, as Eagleton would call it, an ideological term, because it's something that can be defined or redefined according to the taste and the priorities of the age in which it is being discussed. But in every period of time, literature, after all, is fine writing. It's a kind of writing that does not need any defense, any justification, except the fact that it is something that can be considered fine. It is W.H. Auden who wrote, "Poetry makes nothing happen." That's a very profound statement. Poetry does not make anything happen, but poetry speaks about the significance of activities or actions in human existence where something doesn't have to happen. You know, do we have to be utilitarian all the time? Do we have to wonder if it is useful, if it is going to end up in a very significant consequence or contribution later on? Whenever we undertake an action, does it have to move towards something that is very valid? Is this objective, this hard target to achieve, significant, important in human existence all the time? Don't we do a lot many things that are actually of absolutely no use? I remember a passage in a story written by Arthur Conan Doyle, in which Sherlock Holmes takes a flower, a rose in his hands, and starts speaking about the significance of that flower. He says, this is an extra. You know, the rose tells us that, well, for him, God, of course, or the creator, or whatever you would like to call it, has given us something that is absolutely not needed. You know, the rose plant does not need the flower rose because it doesn't have pollen, or its pollen is not used in its reproduction. Remember, rose does not grow out of seeds or anything like that. It is something that grows out of the already existing plant. So obviously, it's not supposed to fertilize and later on transform into seeds. It's not something that is needed for the plant, at least. The plant does not need it. It doesn't have to attract the bees. It doesn't have to provide the honey. It doesn't have to bother about, you know, bees coming, visiting and pollinating or anything like that, mainly because that's not how the rose plant breeds. But still, it is one of the most beautiful flowers in the world. Because as Sherlock Holmes, or as Arthur Conan Doyle tries to tell us, it is an extra, a pure extra, something that shows the goodness, the virtue, the abundance that the Creator is ready to give us. Literature, in a way, is that extra. It's not something that has to produce anything, that has to make anything happen. It's not something that has to lead to a definite consequence. It's not something that you need in order to, you know, achieve the goals, the great goals of your life or anything like that. But it is something that is there, pure and simple. It's there for your pleasure, your entertainment. Well, down the ages, literature has, of course, been given a lot of value. It has become a value-added product because generations of critics, generations of literary students have felt the need to add value to it. Aristotle, for example, said, well, tragedy is something that can ultimately result in catharsis. What is the need of catharsis? Catharsis is something that can purify the human mind of base emotions. And purifying the human mind of base emotions and thus allowing the human being to attain development of one's own identity or one's own selfhood is supposedly the great value of art and literature according to Aristotle. Well, that is the importance of catharsis. Pity and fear are supposed to be two base emotions that hampers the development of the individual. When you want to do something, when you want to act according to your talents and according to your inspiration, if you are afraid, remember your natural action will be hampered. It will be prohibited. And if you are obviously, sympathetic to yourself, if you feel very uncomfortable with yourself, if you are diffident, if you are not very confident for that matter, you can again fail in acting. So Aristotle would say tragedy is an art form that can ultimately result in catharsis, purification of the human mind. And because we are talking about a time when the human mind was itself being formulated, it was being theorized. Aristotle was theorizing the human mind at this time. Remember, he was paving the way to the fundamentals of psychology, as it were. And obviously, therefore, he was talking about how human identity was getting formulated and so on, even though he was not using those words. That was what he was doing. And at that particular time, obviously, he was definitely feeling very, very, he was feeling the need for this kind of specific objective for tragedy, objective for the greatest form of art that existed during his time. So even later, when it comes to people like Coleridge or Wordsworth, we can see that they were also talking about how imagination reshaped the world in which we lived. The shaping power of imagination. Imagination is something that maybe dissipates the world as we receive it through our senses, and then reshapes it into something that is new, ideal, as it were, something that is better than what we receive through our senses. So we can see how basically, again, romantic criticism was talking about why literature was useful. Literature is useful because if you want to reshape your world, if you want to see your world as something that is better than what you see with your, or what you experience with your five senses, then you need imagination. And that imagination is the faculty that in a way repeats or reproduces the divine within you, what Coleridge was to call the infinite I am. The infinite I am is Coleridge's term for, remember, the eternal spirit, the eternal mind, which of course is an infinite version of the human mind, the human psyche, which he characterizes as I am, the self, the subject, the human subject. So you can see how in every period of time, we have critics, we have poets, we have writers talking about the use of literature, that it is very useful. A seminal essay written by T.S. Eliot, for example, is titled "The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism." So the use of poetry is useful, and it is against the background of this maybe centuries of the concept of usefulness that suddenly an Auden says poetry makes nothing happen. Poetry is not useful. It is something that's useless, and probably being useless, probably being something without the necessity of this utilitarian demand as the value of literature as far as we are concerned. So it's something that resists the reduction or being reduced to mere utilitarian object. It's something that will not allow you to transform it into a useful object. It is fine, and therefore, obviously, it is not plastic. Plastic art and fine art were two kinds of arts, as Aristotle wanted to talk about them. So it's fine and therefore not plastic. It's not something that is useful. It is not something that is that can be subjected to the principles of everyday use, the principles of utilitarianism, and so on. So it's an object per se, without the necessity of any other validation. It self-validates. It validates itself. And naturally, therefore, it is something that questions that, to use that more fashionable word, deconstructs the very foundation of human need or human use. So that's basically what happens in the case of literature. By being literature, by being some poetry or fiction or whatever, immediately you are in the vicinity of something that does not have to be useful, that does not need a kind of justification as something that is useful. So that is precisely one of the values. It's a value of having no value. But remember, that's not a very simple thing. Again, Eagleton has this wonderful statement. It's not about literature, it's about terrorism, but at the same time, that statement is very interesting. He says, nothing is more insurmountable than nothing. Nothing can be more insurmountable than nothing. Nothing is probably more difficult to maybe shape or handle or appropriate than nothing. How do you appropriate nothing? In nothingness is something that constantly evades your grasp. And by evading your grasp, it is something that allows you to go on and on forever, because your attempt becomes more important than the act of grasping itself. You don't have to grasp. You don't have to catch hold of something. It's a kind of game in which literature tells you, catch me if you can, and you can't catch it. That is the beauty of literature. You can't at any point of time catch it and say, well, this is what is literature after all. No, there are many things in this world that are no longer beautiful if you get hold of it. I remember, for example, back in the 1990s, when I was living in Kodamangalam, the time when Johnson talked about, we went to watch Neelakurinji, because that was the time when Neelakurinji bloomed in a place called Rajamala in Munnar. And we went there, and when we were going towards Rajamala, people were coming back with a bunch of those flowers in their hands, and they said, well, this is what you are going to see, and this is ugly. Neelakurinji is an ugly flower as far as ordinary people are concerned, because once they caught it, once they got hold of it, it was no longer beautiful. It was beautiful when it stayed in nature, when it stood in bunches, maybe in never-ending line, and maybe 10,000 you could see at a glance, as the daffodils were seen by Wordsworth. Then it was beautiful. But the moment you caught it in your hands, it was no longer beautiful. It was a very ordinary flower, something that probably is less beautiful than a rose or a lily, because or definitely lotus, because it's a very ordinary flower with it's not even Neela, blue. It's a very dirty shade of violet, actually, and it doesn't have that aura of let us say beauty or aesthetic pleasure that we usually associate with very lovely flowers. But at the same time, Neelakurinji still remains one of the things you wait for. Not because you can get hold of it, but it is something that's beautiful when you don't get hold of it. It is not something for your consumption. It is something for you to watch from a distance. So I'm not saying literature is a very, very kind of divine, magical subject that you should not touch or anything like that. You can touch it, you can defile it, you can put it upside down, no problem. But remember, whatever you do with it, don't think that you have actually done everything with it, because something will be left behind. Something of it will be left behind for the rest of the humanity to come and handle it. Think about reading Shakespeare, for example. People have been reading Shakespeare for generations. They exhaustively read Shakespeare. They criticized Shakespeare, read him, interpreted him time and again. But even now, Shakespeare is available for more interpretation. But this richness, this abundance of matter that is hidden within the recesses of literature is something that we consider as its real worth, real value. There is a kind of abundance. There is definitely something that that will allow you to further explore it when you think you have already done all the exploration possible. It will still remain unexplored. It is the unexplored territory that always fascinates you, because it can never be completely exhausted. That is the pleasure of literature. Definitely, there are scholars later than me who will definitely talk about the significance of reading, the significance of reading literature along with other forms of art and so on. And I will definitely confine myself to the general ideas, but at the same time, remember, literature, you cannot think about literature without also thinking about the significance of reading it. So I might kind of cross into their territory a little bit once in a while. So one of the things I have always noticed is that literature is something that becomes deeper and deeper when you go on reading it, mainly because literature is formulated within an abyss. Right. Nietzsche, in a wonderful book called The Birth of Tragedy, speaks about how art is, or creativity is Dionysian. You know, creativity is Dionysian. It is a kind of balance between the Dionysian and the Apollonian. But what is Dionysian? Dionysian is what we would call the dark depth, the mystery, the kind of you know, unexplorable or you know, unreadable inside that is figured forth in something that is definitely more systematic in the Apollonian form. Apollonian is the form, and Dionysian is what we would call the soul, if you want to use that word. But you know, even if you don't bother about using the word soul, you can say it is the inside, the inner reality of creativity. Creativity is always this building up of a form using the Apollonian rational force, you know, around the Dionysian irrational inner reality. There is an irrational Dionysian inner reality, and a beam. You know, it's what you might call a mise en abyme around which you actually construct literature. Because literature is always placing itself or positioned on a precipice. You know, it's almost on the verge of falling in. It is something that negotiates this thin line between rationality on the one hand and the irrational on the other. It is something that can at the same time be rational and irrational, and thus destroys the distinction between rationality and irrationality. Because remember, it is Shakespeare who again said, you know, the lover, the lunatic, and the poet are the same, because all three of them can create a shape out of nothingness, out of airy nothingness. They create shapes and give them names. That's what the poets do. Everything the poet does is also, in a way, everything that a madman can also do at a certain other level. Remember the poem Kubla Khan, in which there is Coleridge talking about how the moment of creativity is also the moment in which the poet becomes or is similar to a madman. You know, someone with maybe his hair spread on water, and probably someone who is no longer rational. That moment of irrationality, that moment of accessing the abysmal, accessing the you know, the depth, accessing the irrational depth of being, is precisely the moment of literature. But since the irrational being is something that cannot be figured forth, something that cannot be given a physical form, you also need a certain balance, which according to Nietzsche, you bring about with the help of the Apollonian. So the Apollonian rationality of the Apollonian form definitely is the one in which you you know, characteristically place this Dionysian spirit. So if you dislodge the Apollonian form, if you gradually unlayer the Apollonian form, ultimately you will fall into the dark depth of the Dionysian. And the moment when you fall into the dark depth of the Dionysian is the moment of discovering literature. You know, literature is something to be discovered, in which you remove the cover, maybe layer by layer. And what is revealed is this ultimate darkness, this ultimate moment of mystery, this moment of creativity, which of course is the maybe the aporetic moment, something that Paul de Man would call the aporetic moment, where all your logical possibilities end and the very creativity opens up a multitude of possibilities. Your logic ends, and once your logic ends, anything can happen. And that moment at which anything can happen is the moment at which creativity flowers forth, and that is the moment at which literature comes into being. So in order to feel literature, it's very important to feel literature. Reading literature is actually feeling literature, because literature opens up the sixth sense, as it were. It's like mantra, as an Indian critic like Sri Aurobindo might tell you. It's like a mantra. It is a kind of mantra that opens up the divine ananda within you. It's an experience of maybe opening up the innermost recesses of your mind and discovering within you this infinity that you have never or you never thought existed within you. Right. Remember, when Coleridge speaks about the infinite I am, remember the infinite I am is within you. You don't feel that infinite I am all the time, but if you are in close communion with literature, if you are in close communion with the writers, obviously you suddenly feel one with the infinite, one with the multiplicity of reality, because it's an experience in which you dissolve yourself and become one with everything around you. Keats might call it negative capability. It's what you might call negative capability. Can you become everything that is around you, forgetting the fact that you are yourself? The moment you can forget that you are yourself, and you can become one with all the other objects, not necessarily human beings, remember. You can also be a dagger that floats in the air in Macbeth. You can become a sofa or a settee, as in the Cooper, as in a poem by Cooper. You can become a mousey, as in a poem written by maybe Burns. You can be the tiger or the lamb. You can be anything in this world. You can transform yourself into the multiplicity of forms that constitutes your universe, constitutes the universe of your experience. And that is precisely the world literature invites you to. It is not a question of trying to understand everything, possess everything, consume everything, use everything, but it's a question about forgetting yourself and your uses and becoming one with those objects, feel with them. One of the Indian epics, for example, or the Indian epic, for example, begins with the famous dictum, Ma Nishada Pradishtam Tvamagama Chashwati Sama Yat Kraunja Mithuna Degamavati Kama Mohidam. When the poet becomes one of the birds that is shot down, when the poet becomes the bird that experiences the sorrow. There are two birds, one is shot down and murdered, the other, of course, becomes the bereaved lover or whatever, and it becomes lonely. And the poet becomes both at the same time. The poet becomes Rama and Sita at the same time. The poet becomes the person who can feel the sorrow of the whole world. The poet becomes, for example, the Christ figure who can bear the burden of all the sins of the world and get on his own cross without mumbling even a single word of objection. So that is the kind of experience that that literature provides to you, and that is what happens when you are a proper reader. A proper reader is, remember, the Sahridaya, and Sahridaya is somebody who has a heart that is equal to that of the writer. Samana Hridayatvam, Sahridayatvam. Sahridayatvam is having the same mind as that of the creator. Or as E.M. Forster was to say, become minor authors in your own right. That's basically what a proper reader does. A proper reader is an author of a kind, because without becoming an author, without providing maybe the realities or maybe the details that you want to add using your own imagination, your reading is not complete. For example, we cannot imagine a Hamlet, or we cannot imagine a Macbeth, or we cannot imagine even a daffodil unless we provide the details. My daffodils is very different from yours, probably because the daffodil flower I have seen is very different from the daffodil you have seen. My Hamlet is very different from yours because maybe I have a much deeper experience or a very different experience of the kind of experiences Hamlet has gone through. I have, for example, experienced death in a different way. I've experienced dilemmas of existence in a different way, and I have experienced maybe even the faithlessness of the world in a different way. That's one of the problems of Hamlet anyway. How you are going to be forgotten, how you are going to be left in the moment of forgetfulness sooner or later, because death is the only reality, the only inevitable reality. And once you are dead, probably in 2 months' time, you will be forgotten. That is what happens to King Hamlet. And Gertrude, somebody who was in love with King Hamlet, somebody who doted on him as if her appetite increased on what she fed on or whatever. This Gertrude is somebody who forgot him in 2 months' time and married his brother, who is no one compared to King Hamlet. Hyperion to a satire, as the expression that Hamlet uses. The similarity between King Hamlet and Claudius is that of Hyperion and satire. Hyperion is the sun god, and satire is a half animal, half human kind of god. So that kind of figure. So a beast. So how can you forget someone like King Hamlet so easily in 2 months' time? If you can forget King Hamlet in 2 months' time, you can forget Prince Hamlet probably in half that time, maybe in 1 month's time. And that means that is the time you are going to be remembered in this world. So what is immortality and what is mortality? All these are problems that you might confront in a much deeper manner if you have personal experiences of these sorrows or these existential problems in your own life. So in a way, the way you read Hamlet at the age of 22 or the way you read it at the age of 50 or 57 is going to be very different. So because you have advanced in your age and you have probably increased your experience and so on. So this is the way in which literature continues to open up. One of my friends, for example, used to say, when he was a young man, Dostoevsky was a better writer than Tolstoy. But when he became older, Tolstoy became better than Dostoevsky. Not necessarily because either Dostoevsky is better or Tolstoy is better, but because your understanding of Tolstoy gradually grows upon you. And the more mature you become, the more mature your understanding of Tolstoy. Because the kind of whirlwind energy that Dostoevsky has is not something that you see, at least at the outset, in a Tolstoy. Because Tolstoy is a much more mellowed and much more, kind of contained kind of energy. It's an energy that will open up to you only by and by, only gradually. Whereas the other one will explode on you. One is almost like a very soft running brook, whereas the other is like a volcano. And when you are a young person, you are probably more enamored of the volcano. And later on, you would be happier with the brook because the volcano starts frightening you probably. So that kind of thing. So, literature will open up a different world to you as you become older, as you add to your experiences, as you get more and more of your experiences and so on. So essentially, therefore, to be in the vicinity of literature or to be a reader of literature is actually to open yourself up, forget yourself, forget your identity, and become one with the writer. And remember, the writer himself or herself is somebody who has forgotten himself and herself and become one with the objects that he or she writes about. So you can see how the author's negative capability has already made the author a kind of vacant position in the text which you can occupy. But the moment you occupy it, you dissolve yourself and become dissipated into a multitude of objects that are formed within the creativity, within the energy that you call creativity, which the author or the writer has employed. This is the experience that literature can provide you with, literature can give you. If you cannot attain this, obviously, if you cannot go near literature like this, you will definitely reduce it to a set of textbooks on which you can write annotations and short answer questions. Now, as a teacher who has taught for more than 32 years, I would say one of the greatest dangers of a syllabus is that it is a syllabus. It is a syllabus that has to be read and understood and criticized in order to get marks in the examination. But you will become a true student of literature the moment you transform the syllabus into something much more and start reading the texts both within and without the syllabus with a kind of insight that will make you a better human being, make you a much better, more insightful person, and definitely make you a more sympathetic person. Because remember, sympathy or empathy or whatever you call it, or the ability to become one with the other, is definitely one of the essential characteristics of literature. Literature is the space in which the other gets its voice. That's something which we have to always remember. Histories usually hide the voice of the downtrodden, hide the voice of the maybe what you might call the borders, the outside, people who are obviously, or communities, beings that are obviously hidden, will not be heard in a history, because history is always written by people with very specific interests. And it will not be heard probably in economics, it will not be heard in even philosophy, but it will always be heard in literature, because a writer is someone whose mind is open. It's almost like the taut strings of a violin, and it will start producing music even when a soft breeze comes in. So it's that sensitive, that sensitiveness. For example, you can read Shakespeare from the point of view of a feminist without any problem. Can you think of a more feminist text than maybe an As You Like It or a Twelfth Night? But remember, Shakespeare lived at the peak of patriarchy. He was definitely not a feminist. He was not someone who knew what feminism meant. He was living at a time when patriarchy itself was consolidating its power and its position, because that was a time when obviously the Western world was transforming into what you might call the world of the new capital. And definitely that is the world in which what you might call patriarchy established itself. So in a way, Shakespeare was living at a time when patriarchy was getting established. But if you want to read Shakespeare from a feminist perspective, you can read him like that, because he is both patriarchal and a feminist at the same time. It's only a writer of literature who can do that, be the opposites at the same time, represent both the sides at the same time, give voice to maybe the most voiceless, along with, of course, speaking about the most vociferous and vocal at a particular point of time. Shakespeare definitely was talking about the most vocal at the time, no doubt about that. He was talking about, for example, people who were afraid of witches, right? Read Macbeth. And you can see that it was written precisely because he was living at a time when witch hunt was becoming very, very fashionable, mainly because King James the First of England loved witch hunting, and he was a person who had actually written a monograph on witch hunting. And he was somebody who was thinking of witch hunting as a very important activity. So Shakespeare writes a play in which witches are presented in a very negative manner. But at the same time, remember, it's also the play that will tell you these witches are also human beings. These witches are human beings, and they are actually people who interpret the activities of the human beings. Isn't there another way in which you can understand the witches as people who are more intelligent, who are in the outskirts of human civilization and human society, and that is their tragedy? It's not only a tragedy of Macbeth, it's also a tragedy of the witches in a way. So you can read the play like that because Shakespeare is someone who will read all these experiences into them. Think about, for example, a character like Shylock. Remember, Shakespeare was living at a time when definitely anti-Semitism was gradually developing in the Western world. You know, when you read writers like Hannah Arendt and so on, you can see how anti-Semitism had a much longer history. It did not suddenly begin in 20th century. It began in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Western world. And in a way, the very characterization of Shylock is a product of anti-Semitism that existed in the Western world, especially even during the Elizabethan times. But isn't Shylock a character who deserves our sympathy, and in a way who suddenly captures our imagination and suddenly appears to be another human being who has had the misfortune to do the wrong thing and therefore now has to suffer at the hands of his own destiny? Well, Shylock is as much a tragic hero as a Hamlet or a Macbeth. If that happens, that's because Shakespeare knew that this anti-Semitism was not the true stuff, or it is not the only way in which you have to think about it. The anti-Semitic in the Elizabethan world prompted the creativity in Shakespeare to think about the Jew as someone who also was a human being, who deserved our sympathy, who could run out of the hands of the writer and become an individual and a subject in his own right. So that kind of a transformation is something that happens in literature. Literature is therefore the place where, the space, the locus within which the other gets its voice. The other's voice is recorded. It gets recorded. It gets recorded, and therefore it's awaiting us to read it. You know, every reader therefore also is a person who listens not only to the dominant voices of literature, but also to those hidden sounds, those sounds that you can hear only if you listen with a maybe much more sensitive ear. It's almost, the screeching voice of maybe a bird or an animal that is being kept in probably kept hidden. Remember, it is the voice of the woman in the attic. It is the voice of the madman who is always considered as someone who is dangerous to civilization and society, but at the same time, remember, is also the Tom of Bethlehem, who is probably the wisest man in King Lear. You know, he's that kind of a person. At the height of your madness, you are more intelligent. At the height of your exclusion, you are the most included. At the height of your silence, you probably are the most voiced. This is the the strange experience of literature. This is the experience of literature that beckons you, that invites you to be one with it, to be part of a much larger world that definitely is awaiting your understanding, your acceptance out there. Now, basically, therefore, this is also an induction program, so I am supposed to induct you, even though I don't know how to induct people into literature as such, but unless it has that magical pull, then nobody else is going to wave the magic wand for you or anything like that. That's not always possible. But remember, literature is something that has to be experienced at first hand. It's not something that another person can open up for you. I can only lead the way, or a teacher can only lead the way. The teacher cannot give you the sense of literature. For example, think about what literature does to time. Time is something that gets telescoped, and probably time is something that gets recorded in literature. Kunjunni, for example, is a Malayalam poet whom you probably have heard quite a lot. Kunjunni says, "Kalam kurukki eduppadallo kala." I have the habit of repeating this particular sentence to most of my students. Kalam kurukki eduppadallo kala. There is a very plain meaning to that statement, because it just says kalam or time is something that is that becomes the content of poetry or art in general. Art is a representation of time. You might come up with that kind of a very plain statement. But look at the statement, kalam. In Malayalam, kalam is a combination of two long syllables. Ka is ka, the vyanjanam, and the dirgha swaram. It's dirgham. In Malayalam, the rhythm is always fixed by dirgham and hraswam. And in a way, in kalam, ka is dirgham. Lam has anuswaram, the sound, which again is a vowel, and therefore it is again dirgham. So kalam is a word that is long, in the sense it is dirgham. And when you make it shorter, when you remove the dirgham, take the a out of ka and the out of lam, and it becomes kala. So you can see how poetry performs what it speaks about. Poetry performs what it speaks about. Poetry is not a description of life. Literature is not a description of reality. Literature is a representation. It's a presentation of reality. It is something that repeats reality. So you are not looking at a mirror image of reality, but you are looking at reality itself. Literature is as real as reality. And when you read literature, remember, you are not reading a second or a secondary representation or an imitation of reality, but you are reading what is already real. You don't need another reality, because kalam is shortened in kala. That shortening happens within the poem. That shortening also happens, outside in the world of art in general. So that kind of the artwork, the literary form repeats what it tries to speak about. So it's not a question of reading and understanding with your intellect. It's a question of turning your intellect into your eyes and your ears and your skin, your body. Make it touch the poem, make it smell the poem, make it read and maybe taste it. So all the five senses through which you experience reality become one and transform itself into the intellect. So in a way, literature is something that overcomes the distinction between the intelligent and the sensible, right? The intelligent, the intellectual, or rather the, what you can understand with your intellect and what you can experience with your sense. Literature overcomes that distinction. It kind of destroys that distinction, and it definitely goes beyond that distinction and goes into a world of reality that is definitely beyond the opposition between the intelligent and the sensitive or the sensible. They, what is understood as an idea and what is experienced as an emotion, and therefore literature can go beyond even the distinction between idea and emotion. That's why Eliot said, a thought to Donne was an experience. The thought to Donne was an experience because when Donne thought about something, he was not actually just thinking with his brain, thinking with his intellect, but it had become an experience, something that he could experience with his body, with his eyes and his ears and his tongue and his, the sense of touch or whatever. So it's this maybe turning into something that is sensible, something that is primarily an idea, is what literature ultimately does. And therefore, literature approaches a totality of experience, which you cannot get in other places. Literature invites you into this totality of experience. It breaks down the distinctions and takes you into that world where you are the total being. You are the being with every faculty open and sensitive. That is what literature will do for you. And if you are able to experience literature as this kind of a text that opens up the best in you and the deepest in you, then obviously the rest of it, the short questions and the essays and the annotations, become maybe very, very simple and probably what people might call kid stuff. Nothing more important than that. So read literature with this kind of a passion. Read literature as if your life depends on it. It's almost like the stories that Scheherazade told, because the moment Scheherazade started narrating her stories, she could not stop, because if she stopped, she would lose her head. That is the way in which literature functions in your life. You have to read it as if your life depends on it. As if you stop reading it, you might lose your head, and you might lose your reality. You might lose yourself and lose probably your life as a whole. So that is the time when you are at one with literature. That's when you will be able to open up literature, and then literature will tell you everything that you need to hear from it. And then studying literature does not become, or it is no longer an activity. It is something as normal and commonplace, probably natural, and as life-giving as your life breath. So literature, or text of literature, remember, is the precious lifeblood of a human being. Milton said man, but Milton, remember, was a patriarchal writer. We are not patriarchal anymore, so we have to say book is the precious lifeblood of a human being. Milton said a book is a precious lifeblood of a man. It is written with the lifeblood of a person. So you are actually in the proximity of another person's lifeblood, and reading is the activity of mixing your blood with that person's blood, and the two will start flowing together. That is the experience of literature, and I hope you will be able to access that kind of an experience while reading literature. And of course, that will be a moment when literature will become accessible to you like nothing else. And all the best to all the students, and also all the teachers. Make learning a kind of mutual experience of exploration. You explore your teachers as much as the teachers explore you. I know your teachers very well, and most of them are very, very learned. But the learning is out there to be explored by the students. Students have to go on voyages into the minds of the teachers and start searching for whatever they have hidden there. These teachers are not always very open. They might hide quite a lot from you. So try to, uh, explore their minds, explore their memories, their intellects, their world of ideas, and open them up so that you can definitely benefit the most from them. And you are definitely at the beginning of that wonderful voyage, and bon voyage, dear friends. Thank you. Johnson.
Thank you, Indral sir, for that marvelous talk. You were always marvelous as this talk was us. It was quite marvelous as you're always doing it. It was quite engrossing, and personally, it was an occasion for me to recuperate some of the texts and some of the ideas which I've already read and have been thinking about. And I'm sure that this is a real induction for the students here. And now the floor is open for discussions. If you have some questions, you can ask Indral sir. I find some of the students expressing their comments. Manu Prakash says this is highly enlightening, and he gives you his pranam. Anil Kumar is from Tamil Nadu, and he says this was he says it's a poetic and scholarly lecture, and he thanks you for that. And now, if anyone has any doubts to raise, please.
Actually, it doesn't have to be questions. It can also be rejoinders, additions, we can think together so that your thoughts are as important to me as my thoughts are to you, I hope.
Amarnath says he has one question, and Amarnath, please, go ahead. Amarnath, are you there? Sir, Albina has asked, which one would you say, age or experience, that enhances the essence in which we perceive literature, or is it both?
Well, I think both, because there is not much difference between age and experience as I use those terms, because age is, in my conception, age is not just advancing in the years, but age is having more and more experience anyway. Experience not only of new context in your existence. It's also experience of new texts, new literature, and so on. You are constantly exploring the world around you, using your life, using your reading, using your ability to watch movies or look at paintings or whatever. So it's always an exploration. You're constantly studying something, constantly experiencing something. So whether you like it or not, an advancing age means more experience. Unless you have all your senses shut down, you will have, of course, more experiences as you advance in your age. Unless you are in a state of, vegetative existence, which is not always possible. You cannot have a vegetative existence unless you are in a coma or something like that. Otherwise, you have experiences. So advancing age also means more experiences, and therefore more experiences and more age are not contradictory to each other. They are actually the same, to a certain extent at least. But you can have more experience even when you are young in age, remember. It doesn't mean you have to be older in order to understand literature. You can have a lot of experience even as a young person, and that will definitely make you someone who is much older in a metaphorical sense than the other people of your age. Some people appear to be more mature. We call it more mature, but actually they are older, remember. So I think both are same.
Okay. Any more additions or clarifications?
Amarnath has actually posted a question. Purification of emotion. I think he's talking about the word catharsis I talked about.
Yes.
Of course, it is purification, no doubt. Purification or purgation. Aristotle was talking about purgation, and purgation means purification because he was actually talking about a kind of medical technology in which you purify your body of bad blood through a process of catharsis. Catharsis was a process that the Greek medicine men used. They believed when you are sick, it's actually because of a loss of balance in the the biles, the humors, and one way in which you could regain balance was by draining the bad blood out of your body, which they used to do with a technology called catharsis. So catharsis comes from Greek medicine. And this is precisely what later medicine men also used to do with leeches, remember. Leeches were used by even Indian physicians in order to suck bad blood out of the body, because Ayurveda also believed your body is made up of 3 different kinds of fluids. And if one of these fluids is in excess, obviously you need to remove it by allowing leech to suck it out. So you have Dhanvantari, the god of medicine in India, holding a leech in his hands. So that's the kind of idea that you have when you talk about or think about purgation. So purgation is that kind of sucking the evil or the bad out of your system or your body using some kind of a technique. And for Aristotle, it was tragedy. Tragedy was that technique as far as he was concerned. So it was a purification of the body. It was a kind of regaining of balance that Aristotle was talking about.
Sir, we have 3 more questions. One is by Riya Ajit. Is literature a mirror of life or representation of reality, or is it both?
Yeah, basically, a wonderful book I have read is by M.H. Abrams, and it is called The Mirror and the Lamp. Abrams talks about how classical conception of literature talks about literature or art as a mirror of reality. Whereas after the Romantic period, we think about literature or art as a kind of a reproduction or a kind of production of reality, which is almost like a lamp. A mirror reflects light, whereas a lamp produces it. So that's the difference that this wonderful book uses as a contrast. But basically, I think whether you call it a mirror or a lamp, it is a question of reproducing. It's a question of representing. It's a question of producing that experience. Producing that experience, which is not mere reflection. Because if it is mere reflection, remember, it will be exactly like reality. But it cannot be exactly like reality. It's another reality, a reality in which there is a multitude of possibilities, that you do not normally see in the reality around you. In realism, for example, they used to see only what is physically visible or physically available for the 5 senses. Naturally, they have to think about the real as something that could be seen, that could be heard, or whatever. But when it comes to later writing, you can see that the real is no longer something that is out there in the world. It's something that is reproduced by the human imagination, by the innermost faculty of the human mind, something that contains maybe reality in all its variety. and reality in all its variety, remember, must be infinite. So literature is capable of reproducing that infiniteness because it is not merely a mirror or a reflection of what can be reflected as the outside reality. That's why I always love to or like to think about it as something that is a presentation, as in Kalam Kurukkiyeduppathallo Kala, or as in many of the poems where, you know, when a particular experience is reproduced, you can see the art form itself has that experience in it. The language becomes different. The language suddenly starts reproducing the reality as much as it represents or you know, uses the meaning of words to describe it. It's not just a description of that reality. Along with that description, along with that, you know, the use of words to mean that reality, it also reproduces that reality in its whole multiplicity of meaning. That's precisely what I feel.
We have a few more questions. Malavika M. Nair asks you, do you think literary canon acts as a hindrance to relishing a work without prejudice?
If you take it as a canon, yes. Because if you are not able to read Wordsworth, anything other than a lover of nature and a poet of nature, then obviously it hinders your understanding of Wordsworth, your experience of Wordsworth. You know, if you think that T.S. Eliot, for example, is just a modernist poet, and modernist poetry has to be like this and so on, then obviously it becomes a hindrance, no doubt about that. But the canon helps you probably to look at the most commonly read texts in that period, and gives you a primary idea of how to go about reading that period, so that you can break down the canon. You know, the canon is there so that it can be broken down. In order to enter the world of true literature, you have to break down something. You have to you know, penetrate. And what is there to penetrate or break down? A canon is something that is there to break down. So you can take the canon, break it up, and probably write against it. And the moment you start writing against it and breaking it up, it starts giving you further insight into the deeper meanings of literature for that particular period. So, for example, reading Eliot as a modernist is important. As long as you are not going to be hindered by that reading, and you are also ready to read him as a romantic, right? If it's possible, for example, for you to read Eliot as a romantic poet, wasn't he somebody who was talking constantly about the self, about himself? However fragmented, however broken down, however, you know, in pieces he was, remember, he was still talking about himself. He was actually trying to produce and reproduce his self again and again through his poems. And in that sense, he was doing exactly what a Wordsworth or a Coleridge was trying to do. And therefore, he was a latter-day romantic. Right? So is it possible for us to read modernism as a kind of later romanticism, or romanticism as a kind of earlier modernism, or both are same as responses and reactions against, responses to and reactions against modernity? Two different, slightly different responses, but both of them are responses anyway. So literature starts opening itself up to you the moment you start, again, to use a wonderful phrase that was constantly used by Terry Eagleton, reading against the grain, right? So you have to start reading against the grain of the text. And the canon is the grain. And the moment you start reading against the canon, you are actually reading literature against the grain. And that will definitely be more perceptive. And that is definitely very, very useful also for you. And therefore, I think canon is useful, provided you don't think canon is something that needs a kind of canonical or canonized sacredness. Don't think of the canon as something that is canonized sacredness. Think of it as something that is there to be broken down. The great tradition which is waiting for you to break it down with your own particular private personal axe. So use your axe. That's it. Cut it down.
Sir, Nessie Darwin requested to explain your statement. Literature is not a representation of reality, but reality itself.
I think I have also already explained it again, but again I'll talk about it more. The question is, what is reality? Part of the problem with human beings is that we always ask the question, what is reality? As if reality matters. There are certain things that exist in this world just because we started asking the question, what it is. For example, there is a wonderful book again called The Meaning of Life, written by Terry Eagleton, in which the question, he says, the problem is with the question, what is the meaning of life? Why do you have to bother about the meaning of life at all? It's a question that we have never asked. Similarly, the problem with reality is that we have always been worried about reality. You cannot wish it away, remember, because that's a part of our history anyway. Part of human existence, part of human humanness is made up of our dilemmas about, or our excruciating thoughts about, our very painful issues regarding this notion of reality. But remember, reality has never been one reality. It has always been different. My reality is not the same as yours. Your reality is not the same as somebody else's. There are as many realities as there are human beings in this world, as many realities as there are, let us say, animals in this world. Have you ever imagined how your pet dogs see you? They don't see you as you see yourself. Your image of yourself is constituted by the mirrors that you have looked into. Have you ever seen yourself? Actually not. You have only seen your own reflections. You have never seen yourselves. It's impossible for a human being to see oneself because our eyes do not have the capacity to look back at itself. We can only look at our own images. And remember, any image that I look at is already distorted by, it is already reshaped by, reformulated by the medium that image is formed by the mirror that I look at, by the water that I look in, or by somebody else's eyes that I look at, or whatever. Wherever I see myself, remember, myself is always reformulated by that other, surface which is reflecting me. So what is my reality? Have I ever seen it? My reality, or my reality as I see it in myself, is as many as I have looked at, as many realities as there are mirrors in this world. When I look next time into a new mirror with a new type of distortion, I will see a different me, definitely. So what is the real that we are talking about? The real that we are talking about is constantly changing, constantly, getting transformed. And in that sense, literature is a kind of mirror, as Shakespeare says. It's a mirror held up to nature, remember. And nature is multiplicity. Therefore, it is in a way a singular mirror, not the normal ordinary mirror. It's a singular mirror that's capable of producing reality that is multiple, that is infinite in its, in its representation or representationality, and therefore naturally something that cannot be exhausted. It is reality that will go on and on. As many realities as there are my, so the kind of my sense of myself when I read or read Hamlet at the age of 22 is very different from my sense of myself when I read it now. Because I read myself through Hamlet. I read myself through T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, through Daffodils, through maybe Anne Frank's diary. Maybe I read myself through movies that I watch. So I'm reading myself all the time. And in that sense, it's a reality that cannot be represented. It's a reality that can only be produced in its multiplicity. Okay.
Yes, sir, I hope we can take one more question, and there are 3 questions, but then we'll take one and stop. Tejasini Manoj asks you, you mentioned how everything we engage in does not have to be useful or productive. So the question of literature being useful or not is irrelevant. But can we actually imagine a life without literature and art? Isn't it an essential part of human life?
Communication is essential to form society. But if human beings existed in the primal form of animals, we would not need literature. So literature is needed only because we think of ourselves as social animals. As we think of ourselves as forming social organizations, think of ourselves as existing within the larger framework of a social mold. If we don't think of ourselves as a citizen of, a member of, a subject within a social organization, then we would not need literature at all. When I said literature is irrelevant, I was not trying to say literature doesn't have any function. It has the function of precisely implying or indicating that something can exist without a function. That's a very important function, remember. The function or the idea that something can exist without a necessary function, without a utilitarian aspect, is something that's very important, because that's when it gets released from the predicament of being held down by the necessity of utilitarianism, the necessary consequences of utilitarianism, and can fly into the vaster sky of imagination. Art doesn't have to follow certain social dictates. I'm not saying art does not follow social dictates. Art definitely follows social dicta. It follows social organizations and ideas. Art is ideological, no doubt about that. But remember, beneath all these ideological framework, art is one sure way in which we can break down ideology. Well, you will definitely learn more about ideology later, and obviously then you will have to think about it like this, right? If you think about ideology as something as that is compulsory and therefore you cannot escape from, then what is the whole idea or the need of thinking about ideology at all? So at some point of time, you will have to break down ideology. How do you break it down? You break it down using creativity. You break it down using literature. So literature is ideology, but remember, literature is also something that allows you to break down ideology, go beyond ideology, and thus think against the grain. That's a point which I've been trying to make. Why is it capable of doing it? Because it does not have to have a particular function, a relevance at a particular point of time. Whatever relevance you think of at the given time, at the present time, for example, it doesn't have to have any of those things. Remember, when Van Gogh painted, his paintings were seen as absolutely useless paintings. That's the reason why he could not even sell them. Quite a lot of them were given away, and I remember somebody saying the maximum he got was 50 marks or something like that for a single painting, because that's something which he gave away to a postman because he owed the postman 50 marks and he didn't have the money, so he gave him a few of the paintings. So he earned 50 marks, let us say. He had to live on Theo's allowance all the time, mainly because his art was utterly useless. But was it useless? Now, after maybe 100 years or so, we know Van Gogh is probably one of the most meaningful painters of the time. At that time, it did not need any use. Van Gogh was not painting because his painting could be useful. He was painting because he had this urge to paint. He was talking about something that ordinary people, the ordinary society of the time, probably did not understand at that time. But later on, we grew up and became capable of understanding Van Gogh. Van Gogh was much older than us. And then we grew into his age. And then we could understand Van Gogh. Well, you will listen to a wonderful lecture later by Jayaraman sir, who is probably a master in this area. Then you can take it up with him. Then you will definitely penetrate that idea much deeper.
Sir, shall we take one more question? And
Sure.
This is by Malavika Pepulai. Do you think a poet has to reach the mindset of a lunatic for creation? This concept has been denied by some of the modern poets. So, what do you think about it?
The problem with some of the modern poets is that they think too much about their own writing. Right. Anyway. But these modern writers, I don't know what you mean by modern writers, because all writers are modern. Chaucer was a modern poet. Wordsworth was a modern poet. Everybody thought of himself or herself as a modern writer, because modern is a term that is always defined against what is perceived as old-fashioned. And in every age, the age defines itself as modern against what is old-fashioned, everything that comes before it. If you're talking about modernist writers, that is writers like T.S. Eliot and his group, people who thought poetry was more cerebral and so on, well, you know, they wanted to talk about literature as something that is constructed, literature as something that follows the rational or the itineraries of the rational or whatever. But at the same time, they were also trying to think about this interaction between the emotional and the intellectual. One of the theoretical points that Eliot himself makes in Tradition and Individual Talent is the concept of the poetic emotion. So there is emotion. And at some deeper level, poetic emotion is a kind of relationship between what the poet experiences at a given time and all the other experiences that he has around him. For example, he says reading Spinoza and the smell of cooking, together they formulate a kind of specific experience that gets reproduced in poetry. He doesn't say that this is a logical connection. There is no logical connection between Spinoza and the smell of cooking. So these connections are illogical. These connections are irrational. Madness, after all, is the logic of the irrational. Well, you might wonder if there is a logic of the irrational, because it's almost like speaking about the logic of the illogical. But you know, there is the unconscious, there is the language of the unconscious, there is the, you know, kind of the irrational that bursts forth through the rational. Definitely, as I've already said, if you use a little bit of Nietzsche, you might know without the Apollonian rational external form, there is no question of talking about poetry. No doubt about that. Poetry definitely has that, or literature has that formal content or formal element. It is Apollonian, no doubt about that. But the Apollonian element is not the point of literature. That was my argument. The point of literature is the Dionysian depth, the darkness, the mad inner world that the poet tries to carefully figure forth, carefully, kind of enwrap in the form that is definitely Apollonian. No doubt about that. So poet is someone who is much more capable than an ordinary person, because the poet has this capacity to be mad and rational at the same time. We are not talking about madness as a condition that is opposed to rationality. Madness is something that you can have within rationality. You can be mad and be rational at the same time, because literature is something that breaks down these oppositions easily. Therefore, we don't have to worry whether, madness is logical or not. There is a method in this madness, that's all. Literature is actually a method in the madness. There is madness, definitely, but there is a method in it. That's the difference that we always think about.
Okay, dear Indran sir, your talk and the discussion that followed was quite marvelous, engrossing, and enlightening, definitely. And I believe that it must have crystallized the question, why literature and what is the need for literary studies. I'm sure it must have given some clarity to the students who are initiated into this postgraduate program. I take this opportunity to thank you so much for spending your valuable time and sharing your ideas with us. So on behalf of everyone and the Department of English of SH College, I thank you so much. I also take this opportunity to thank the participants, and we'll be joining here on the same platform tomorrow with another professor, Professor B. Hariharan from Kerala University. So thank you and good night.
Thank you everyone for this patient listening and also for the wonderful interaction. Thank you, Johnson.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.